She said I was hurting myself. I told her the truth. She was the reason it hurt. The room had that late evening stillness that only comes after a long day, when the world outside finally slows down and everything unspoken begins to surface. The light was soft, almost forgiving, coming from a single lamp near the window. Shadows stretched lazily across the walls. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic, and that was what made it dangerous. She was sitting across from me, close enough that I could sense her presence without looking directly at her. The air between us felt heavy, thick with familiarity and something unnamed. She had been watching me for a while. I could tell by the way her eyes followed small movements I didn't realize I was making. The way my shoulders stayed tense. The way my hands never fully relaxed. She spoke gently, as if raising her voice might shatter something fragile. "You're hurting yourself." The words weren't sharp. They weren't meant to accuse. They landed quietly, like a truth placed carefully on the table between us. I nodded without thinking, the way people do when they don't want to be seen arguing with reality. My gaze stayed fixed on my hands resting on my thighs, fingers interlaced too tightly. I could feel my pulse there, steady but loud. I didn't answer right away. Silence stretched, not awkward, just full. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, the soft hum of the lamp. All ordinary sounds, suddenly amplified. My chest felt tight, as if her words had found a place I'd been avoiding. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees. It wasn't invasive, just closer. Concern lived openly on her face now, no longer disguised by casual conversation or small smiles. "I see it," she said. "The way you don't rest. The way you carry everything alone." I swallowed. Part of me wanted to deflect, to joke, to brush it off the way I always did. That part of me was tired. Another part, quieter but heavier, felt exposed. Seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I finally looked up. Her eyes held mine steadily, not demanding anything, just waiting. That patience hurt more than any accusation could have. I shifted in my seat, the fabric of the chair creaking softly beneath me, and let out a slow breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt thin. Unconvincing even to me. She didn't argue. She just watched me, head tilted slightly, lips pressed together as if holding back more than she was saying. The warmth of the room contrasted with the tension building inside my chest. I was aware of the small distance between us, how easily it could be closed, how deliberately it remained. In that quiet, something fragile began to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough for the truth to start leaking through. Her concern didn't fade after my weak reassurance. If anything, it sharpened, subtle but unmistakable. She straightened in her chair, not taller, just steadier, as if choosing her words with more intention now. The softness in her eyes remained, but there was something firmer beneath it, something that felt heavier than comfort. "You keep saying you're fine," she said calmly, "but you're not living like someone who believes that." The words landed deeper than I expected. I felt them settle in my chest, pressing against places I'd been carefully keeping closed. My jaw tightened. I stared past her for a moment, toward the darkened window, watching my reflection hover there. Tired eyes, a face that looked older than it should have felt. She continued, still measured, still careful. She spoke about the late nights, the way I disappeared when things got difficult, how I stopped reaching out. None of it was said with anger. That almost made it worse. It felt like being examined under a soft light, every flaw visible without harshness to hide behind. I shifted in my seat, crossing and uncrossing my ankles, the restlessness betraying me. Her words began to feel less like concern and more like correction. I knew that wasn't her intention, but intention didn't change how it landed. A familiar pressure built behind my ribs, the kind that came when I felt misunderstood, small, contained, but relentless. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she added. "You don't have to punish yourself." That was when something inside me tightened completely. Punish. The word echoed. I felt suddenly smaller, younger, as if she were standing on the edge of a role I hadn't asked her to step into. My hands clenched against my thighs, fingers digging into fabric as I tried to keep my voice even. "I'm not punishing myself," I said, a little too quickly. She leaned back then, just slightly, not retreating, measuring. Her arms folded loosely, more for balance than defense. But the movement created space where closeness had been. The air shifted with it. "I'm just saying I'm worried," she replied. "And I think you're hurting yourself more than you realize." The room felt quieter after that. Too quiet. Something sharp pressed at the back of my throat. I hadn't planned to say anything more. I hadn't planned to let the words form at all. But they did, slow and heavy, rising from a place I hadn't meant to open. "You started the pain." The sentence left my mouth softly. No accusation in my tone. No heat. Just truth laid bare before I could stop it. Her reaction was immediate, though restrained. She inhaled visibly, then exhaled just as slowly. For a brief second, hurt crossed her face. Quick, unguarded, before composure settled back in. She didn't look away, but something in her gaze changed, as if a line had been crossed that couldn't be erased. Neither of us spoke. The words hung between us, undeniable. I felt exposed, not relieved. Saying it hadn't eased the weight, it had shifted it. The balance between us, once steady, now felt cracked, and I wasn't sure which of us would be the first to reach for the pieces. The silence after my words felt heavier than anything I'd said before. It didn't rush to fill itself. It simply stayed, pressing gently but insistently against my chest. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd named something that should have remained buried. My gaze dropped back to my hands, fingers loosening now, as if the tension had finally found somewhere to go. "I didn't mean it like that," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I could explain what I did mean. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself or pull away. She waited. That patience, steady, grounded, made my throat tighten. Felt like permission. "It wasn't something you did on purpose," I continued. "It just happened." I tried to find the right words, the honest ones that didn't sound like blame. I told her how it started small, how her attention felt different from anyone else's, how she listened without checking the time, remembered details I didn't think mattered, noticed when I was quiet instead of asking me to be louder. None of it felt dangerous at first. It felt safe. I admitted how being around her changed the way I carried myself, how I found myself waiting for her messages, replaying conversations long after they ended, how her kindness didn't feel distant or polite. It felt personal. And that was the part one hadn't been prepared for. She shifted then, moving closer without making a sound. The chair legs barely whispered against the floor. When her hand reached out, it wasn't hurried. Her fingers rested gently over my knuckles, warm and steady, grounding me in the moment. I felt the heat of her skin immediately, the way that simple contact quieted the noise in my head. I didn't pull away. "I didn't know what to do with it," I said, my voice lower now, wanting something I couldn't ask for, feeling seen in a way that made everything else feel emptier by comparison. Her thumb brushed lightly against my hand, once absent-minded, as if the gesture came before thought. The touch wasn't romantic in intention, but it carried weight. It told me she was listening in more ways than one. I confessed how I started pulling back instead of leaning in, how I stayed busy, exhausted myself, convinced that distance would dull the feeling. But it didn't. It just turned it inward, made it ache quietly instead of openly. That was the hurt she'd noticed. That was the part one hadn't known how to name. "I wasn't blaming you," I said, finally meeting her eyes again. "I just needed you to know where it started." Her expression softened, something like understanding settling in. She squeezed my hand gently, not to reassure me, but to acknowledge what I'd trusted her with. The room felt warmer, the earlier tension shifting into something more fragile, more real. For the first time, I felt like the truth wasn't something I had to carry alone. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let my words rest between us, as if moving too quickly might disturb something delicate. Her hand remained over mine, steady and warm, but the pressure softened, giving me space without letting go completely. I could feel the quiet decision in that restraint. "I knew," she said eventually, her voice low, almost careful, "before you ever said anything." The admission surprised me more than I expected. I looked up fully now, searching her face. There was no pride there, no sense of control, only honesty. She explained how she noticed the shift in me long before it became visible to others. The way my attention lingered. The way my tone softened around her, even when I tried to keep it neutral. "I didn't want to misread it," she continued. "And I didn't want to encourage something I wasn't sure I could handle responsibly." Her words weren't defensive. They carried weight, as if each one had been measured and held before being released. She spoke about the space between intention and impact, how caring deeply didn't always mean acting on it. How being aware of the imbalance between us made her cautious in ways that felt necessary but cost her more than she'd expected. As she spoke, her thumb resumed its slow movement against my hand, tracing small, almost absent patterns. The gesture contradicted her restraint, and I felt the tension in that contrast. She wasn't unaffected. She had simply chosen silence. "I thought pulling back would make it easier," she admitted. "For you. For both of us." Her gaze dropped then, just briefly, and I caught the vulnerability there. It was quiet, not dramatic, but unmistakable. She talked about how distance wasn't coldness, it was fear. Fear of being the reason someone young and still forming himself would carry something too heavy too soon. Fear of becoming a chapter in his life that complicated everything else. "I didn't want to be a detour," she said softly, "or a regret." The words settled in my chest, reshaping everything I thought I understood. I realized how much she had been holding back, not from lack of feeling, but from too much of it. The confidence I'd always seen in her hadn't disappeared. It had been working overtime, keeping her from crossing a line she wasn't sure she had the right to cross. She lifted her eyes back to mine. This time, she didn't hide behind composure. "But I didn't realize that my silence would hurt you more than honesty." Her hand squeezed mine gently, once. An apology without the word. I felt something inside me loosen, the sharp edge of my earlier accusation dulling into understanding. In that moment, she wasn't the composed, untouchable woman I'd placed on a pedestal. She was someone who had been choosing restraint every day, even when it meant denying herself connection. And for the first time, I saw her silence not as rejection, but as a quiet, imperfect act of care. The room felt different after her confession, as if the air itself had softened. What had once been charged with tension now held something gentler, heavier in a new way. We were no longer circling the truth. We were sitting inside it. Without either of us acknowledging it, the distance between our chairs closed. Not all at once, just enough that our shoulders nearly brushed when we shifted. It wasn't intentional, not exactly. It felt like gravity finally being allowed to do its work. Every small movement carried weight now. Every pause felt deliberate. Conversation slowed. Words came less often, and when they did, they were quieter, almost cautious. There were moments when neither of us spoke at all, when the silence wasn't something to endure but something to listen to. I became acutely aware of her presence. The warmth of her arm near mine, the subtle rhythm of her breathing, the way she tilted her head when she studied me. She reached up at one point, fingers hovering near my temple as if she'd forgotten herself. For a brief second, she hesitated. I could see the question in her eyes, whether to stop, whether to pull back like before. Instead, she let the movement finish. Her fingers brushed gently through my hair, tucking it back with a care that felt intimate without being possessive. The touch sent a quiet pulse through me. I stayed still, afraid that any movement might break the moment. Her hand lingered just a little too long before falling back to her lap. When it did, the absence of it was almost louder than the contact itself. Neither of us commented on what had happened. We didn't need to. The look we shared afterwards said enough. An acknowledgement that something had shifted, that we were standing closer to a line we'd both been avoiding. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume then, something soft and citrusy, mingling with the warmth of the room. It grounded me in the present, in the reality of her sitting there beside me. This wasn't imagination or projection. This was real, and that realization carried its own kind of risk. She exhaled slowly, folding her hands together as if steadying herself. "This is the part that scares me," she said, almost to herself. I turned slightly toward her. "Because it feels right?" She met my gaze, surprised by the honesty of the question. A small, conflicted smile appeared on her lips. "Yes," she admitted, "because it feels right." The admission hung between us, fragile and undeniable. It wasn't a confession of love. It didn't need to be. It was an acknowledgement of connection, of how easily closeness had returned once we stopped pretending it wasn't there. We sat like that for a long moment, shoulders finally touching, neither pulling away. The contact was simple, steady, but it carried a quiet intensity. Not urgency, not demand, just awareness. In that shrinking space between us, I understood something clearly for the first time. The danger wasn't in wanting her. The danger was in pretending that wanting her hadn't already changed us both. The closeness lingered, steady and undeniable, but neither of us rushed to fill it with more touch. It felt important to let the moment breathe, to allow the weight of what we'd admitted to settle without being overwhelmed by it. The room was quiet again, though this silence felt different, less defensive, more open. "I need to say something," I began, my voice low. I didn't look away this time. Not because I expect anything, just because I can't keep carrying it alone. She turned fully toward me, giving me her attention without reservation. The seriousness in her expression told me she understood what this moment was asking of both of us. "I don't need to be fixed," I said, "or guided. I'm not looking for someone to tell me who to be." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I just want to know that what I feel isn't something I have to be ashamed of." Her reaction was immediate, though quiet. Something in her posture softened, as if she'd been holding herself upright for longer than she realized. She nodded slowly, absorbing the honesty without trying to redirect it. "I never saw you as something that needed fixing," she said. "I saw someone I cared about. That's what made me afraid." She explained how fear had shaped her choices. Fear of influence, of crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, of becoming a defining figure in my life before I'd had the chance to define myself. Her voice didn't waver, but there was emotion beneath the steadiness, something she'd been containing for a long time. "I was scared that choosing you would mean choosing for you," she admitted. The clarity of it shifted something between us. I leaned in slightly, not close enough to overwhelm, just enough to be honest in my body as well as my words. "I don't want to be protected from feeling," I said. "I want to be chosen." The words stayed in the air, vulnerable and unguarded. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she stood and stepped closer, moving with a careful decisiveness that made my breath catch. She wrapped her arms around me in a slow, deliberate hug, secure, grounding, and deeply personal. Her embrace wasn't hurried or possessive. It felt like reassurance without promise, closeness without assumption. I hesitated only briefly before my arms came up around her back, the contact firming as if my body recognized the truth before my mind did. I rested my cheek against her shoulder, feeling the steady warmth there. We stayed like that, breathing together, letting the hug speak where words had reached their limit. I felt her hand press lightly between my shoulder blades, a protective gesture that didn't diminish me. It acknowledged me. When she finally pulled back, she kept her hands on my arms, meeting my eyes. "I can't promise certainty," she said gently, "but I can promise honesty and intention." It wasn't everything, but it was real. In that moment, I understood that choosing honesty didn't erase fear. It just stopped letting fear make the decisions. The night had deepened without either of us noticing. Outside, the world felt quieter, wrapped in that calm that only comes when most people are asleep. Inside, everything felt newly awake. We stood there for a moment after the hug, not quite ready to step back into distance, not quite ready to cross into something more defined. "We should take this slowly," she said, her voice steady but gentle, as if she were anchoring both of us. "Not because I don't feel it, but because I do." I nodded. The truth of that settled easily in my chest. There was no disappointment in her words, only care. We talked then, openly and without the tension that had shaped earlier conversations. About boundaries that felt respectful rather than restrictive. About the reality of how others might see us, and how that couldn't be ignored, even if it wasn't allowed to dictate everything. I don't want this to be something we rush into and then resent, she said. I want it to be something we step into with our eyes open. I told her I wasn't looking for guarantees, that what mattered was knowing the connection was real and mutual, not something imagined or one-sided. Saying it out loud felt grounding, like placing my feet firmly on the floor after standing on uncertain ground for too long. Eventually, the conversation slowed again. The hour grew late. The moment of leaving approached quietly, without urgency but with weight. She reached for me once more, this time cupping my face with both hands. The gesture was tender, deliberate. Her thumbs brushed lightly along my jaw, as if memorizing something. She leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. It lingered, just long enough to say more than words could, just brief enough to respect everything we'd promised. When she pulled back, her eyes stayed on mine, searching, reassuring. "This doesn't have to hurt anymore," she said softly. "Not like before." When she turned and walked toward the door, I didn't stop her. I watched instead, letting the moment complete itself. The door closed quietly behind her, leaving the room filled with absence, but not emptiness. I stood there for a while after she left, the warmth of her touch still present, the echo of her words settling into something steady. Nothing was resolved in the way stories like to pretend. There were no vows, no certainty about where this would lead. But there was clarity. For the first time, the pain had direction. It wasn't something I was carrying blindly anymore. It had transformed into something cautious, hopeful, and honest. And as the night pressed in around me, I knew that whatever came next, the connection we'd acknowledged would continue to shape me. Not as a wound, but as a turning point. 24.